Imagine a place where the word city does not yet exist, and yet a city is already beginning to take shape. The Great Pyramid of Giza is still almost 6,000 years in the future. Stonehenge is unimaginably far away. There is no writing, no metal, no royal armies, tax records, or palaces. And yet, beside a permanent spring in the Jordan Valley, people raise a stone tower more than 8 meters high, along with a wall that must have demanded thousands of hours of collective labor. Why? To stop an enemy? To hold back floodwater? To mark the boundary between their world and everyone else's? Or did these structures serve a purpose so different from our own way of thinking that we can no longer recognize it? We still do not know. Because ancient Jericho is not a single city. Beneath Tel es-Sultan lie more than 20 archaeological phases of human life, stacked one above another, houses over houses, walls over walls, fires, repairs, abandoned spaces, new settlements. Almost 10,000 years of human decisions compressed into a single mound. And the deeper we go, the less this story resembles the simple legend of the world's first city. Today, Jericho's oldest core lies within Tel es-Sultan, a mound on the western edge of the Jordan Valley. Nearby flows es-Sultan, a permanent spring without which this entire story might never have happened. The surrounding landscape is hot and dry. In summer, the ground loses moisture, vegetation thins, and the open country burns pale under the sun. Yet in the middle of this harsh landscape, the spring creates a patch of green, a place where water does not depend on one lucky storm, but flows day after day. For people living at the end of the Ice Age, that changed everything. You could stay here for a few days, then for a season, then return the following year. And at some point, somewhere between leaving and coming back, a new decision emerged: stay. Traces of human activity at the site reach back to around 10,500 BCE. There is no city yet, no wall that will one day make Jericho famous. This is the world of late Natufian communities, people living on the threshold between two enormous eras. They hunt, they gather wild plants, they process cereals. They know the rhythm of the seasons and increasingly understand where resources can be found predictably. But it would be a mistake to imagine that one morning hunters simply woke up as farmers and began building civilization. The shift towards settled life was not a single breakthrough. It emerged from hundreds of smaller decisions, repeated across generations. Stay a little longer, store a little more, return to the same place, repair a dwelling instead of abandoning it, plan not only for tomorrow but for the season ahead. And here, something changes that archaeology cannot lift from the ground like a flint blade or a stone point. Even the way people think about the future begins to change. A temporary shelter is built with departure in mind. A permanent home is built for a future in the same place. Its floor will be resurfaced. Its walls will be repaired. Food will be stored inside. Children will know where the entrance is, where the hearth is, where the tools are kept. And when enough homes stand together, the space between them stops being a camp. There are neighbors now, shared problems, shared resources, and the need to negotiate. By the 9th millennium BCE, Jericho had become a large, permanent settlement of the pre-pottery Neolithic. Even the name of the period sounds almost contradictory. People are building houses, storing food, organizing major communal projects, but they are not yet using the familiar fired pottery that will become common later. Walls are built from mud brick. Floors are resurfaced again and again. Flint blades break, grow dull, and are replaced. Around the houses, what the people themselves would have regarded as ordinary waste begins to accumulate. Animal bones, plant remains, grain, seeds, charcoal, fragments of tools. Thousands of years later, those ordinary scraps become archaeological evidence. But rising above them is something on an entirely different scale. Sometime in the first half of the 9th millennium BCE, a massive round stone tower appears at the edge of the settlement. Its base is about 9 meters across and narrows slightly toward the top. It stood roughly 8.5 meters high. Inside was a narrow stone staircase of about 20 steps. A stone wall ran beside it. For a moment, remove modern technology from the picture. No truck, no crane, no steel tools, no written construction plan, only stone, human hands, time, and the ability of many people to work toward the same goal. Someone has to quarry the stone. Someone has to move it. Someone has to make sure the masonry holds. And someone has to keep the collective effort going long enough for the structure to exist at all. At that point, the tower is no longer just architecture. It tells us that people were already capable of organizing labor, time, and responsibility on a remarkable scale. But the central question remains: what was it for? The most obvious answer is defense. A wall surrounds the settlement. A tower rises above the landscape. For a long time, that explanation seemed the most natural. Archaeology, however, is often as good at dismantling answers as it is at finding them. Other proposals include protection against floodwater and sediment, control of space near the spring, a communal monument, a place for collective activity, or a structure with ritual significance. Some hypotheses have even linked the tower's orientation to the surrounding landscape and celestial events. But these are hypotheses. None has been conclusively demonstrated. Perhaps the tower served several purposes at once. Perhaps its function changed over time. Or perhaps the real answer belonged to a system of beliefs from which nothing survives except the stone itself. This is where reconstruction first reaches its limits. We can show the shape of the tower. We can restore its proportions. We can imagine mud brick houses around it, the rough surface of the wall, a person entering the dark passage and beginning to climb the stairs. But we cannot honestly show what that person was thinking. Archaeology preserved the steps. It did not preserve the intention. And the more realistic the past looks on screen, the easier it becomes to forget the difference. Yet Jericho was already connected to a world far beyond the oasis. Among the finds is Obsidian, traced to distant sources in Anatolia. That volcanic glass traveled hundreds of kilometers, directly or through chains of exchange, before reaching this settlement. It is tempting to picture early Jericho as a huge migration hub, constantly filled with people arriving from across the region. But isotope evidence suggests a more subtle picture. A recent study of individuals from the pre-pottery Neolithic found that out of 44 people examined, only 2 showed clearly non-local strontium signatures. Most probably grew up in the same geological environment in which they were later buried. The result is almost cinematic in its irony. Objects travel farther than people. A small piece of black volcanic glass crosses vast distances, while families remain, generation after generation, near the same spring. This is not an isolated world. But neither is it a city of constant newcomers. It looks more like a deeply rooted local community, connected to long-distance networks. So how large was it? Estimates vary. One reconstruction suggests an area of several hectares and a population of roughly 1,000 people, perhaps somewhat more. For the 9th millennium BCE, that is an extraordinary concentration of human life. And then we reach a word that sounds deceptively simple: city. Can we really call it that? Compared with smaller settlements of the period, the temptation is obvious. But Jericho at this stage is not yet Uruk, Babylon, or a Bronze Age city. There are no known written archives, no clear evidence of kingship, no palace bureaucracy. It may be more accurate to see it as something transitional, and precisely for that reason, profoundly important. A society that had moved far beyond a seasonal camp, but had not yet become the kind of classical urban center that would emerge much later. And development does not stop there. In the later pre-pottery Neolithic, during the PPNB, domesticated sheep and goats are present at Jericho. That marks a significant shift in how people made a living. But we cannot simply project that picture backward onto the earliest builders of the tower. For the earlier phase, there is no convincing evidence for a fully developed pastoral economy here. Once again, the so-called Neolithic revolution looks less like a sudden revolution than a long chain of experiments. Which plants to cultivate, which animals to keep close, how much food to store, how to divide space, who belongs to a household, and where the dead should remain. That last question brings us to one of the most powerful and enigmatic images from ancient Jericho. At Jericho, as at several other Neolithic sites in the Levant, Some skulls were removed after burial. Later, they could be covered with modeling material to recreate the features of the face. Shells were sometimes placed in the eye sockets. Thousands of years later, what emerges from the ground is not simply a fragment of human remains. It is almost a face, modeled features, a nose, the pale gleam of shell where the eyes once were. The temptation is immediate, to call it an ancestor cult. That interpretation exists, and it remains entirely possible. But we do not know the exact meaning of the practice. It may have been a way to remember relatives, a mark of status, part of a communal ceremony, a means of maintaining a bond between the living and the dead, or several meanings at once, meanings we can no longer reconstruct. This is where ancient Jericho suddenly feels very close. The tower shows society from the outside. These faces bring us closer to its inner world. Some people invested enormous labor in a structure designed to outlast generations. Others recreated the features of the dead, giving them something close to a human presence again. Both are acts of memory. A house becomes more than a roof. A settlement becomes more than a cluster of buildings. The ground itself begins to carry memory and belonging. But now another powerful myth has to be dismantled. Jericho did not grow continuously. The phrase, "the world's oldest city," easily creates the image of one settlement surviving for 10,000 uninterrupted years. Walls steadily rising, streets widening, population increasing century after century. Archaeology shows something very different. The settlement changed in size. Its layout changed. Traditions disappeared, and others replaced them. There were periods of contraction, breaks, and episodes of renewed occupation. At times, activity shifted within the oasis itself. Jericho's history is not a straight line. It moves more like breathing, expansion, pause, return. Again and again, a new Jericho emerges above the traces of an older one. A ruined wall becomes the base of another building. A house settles. The surface is leveled. A new floor is laid above the old one. A doorway disappears beneath a later courtyard. Centuries pass, and the ground rises. A person may live several meters above a floor once walked by people so ancient that their world has vanished from memory. That is how a tell grows. Not a natural hill, but a mound built from human time. By the 4th millennium BCE, the wider Near East was entering another age. Settlements grew larger. Crafts became more specialized. Networks of exchange became more complex. Jericho changed with the world around it. In the early Bronze Age, we began to see an unmistakably urban landscape. Rectangular houses, streets, workspaces, public buildings, and powerful fortifications. Now the word city feels far more justified. And Jericho's location begins to function not only as an ecological advantage, but an economic one. To the west rise the Judean hills. To the east lies the Jordan Valley. Nearby is the Dead Sea. To the south, routes lead toward the Wadi Arabah and areas rich in mineral resources. These routes carried salt, bitumen, stone, copper, agricultural products, and manufactured goods. Egypt, too, formed part of this larger world of contact. Archaeological material shows connections between the southern Levant and the Nile Valley. Jericho was not at the edge of the world. It stood at a crossroads between worlds. And by the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE, its fortifications reached a scale that once again forces us to think about organized labor. One modern estimate suggests that more than 2 million mud bricks may have been used in the early Bronze Age defensive system. This is not a figure copied from an ancient archive. There is no such archive. It is a modern calculation based on the volume of construction. But even as an estimate, it makes the invisible work behind the wall suddenly visible. Clay has to be gathered, mixed with water and other ingredients, shaped in molds, dried in the sun, carried, lifted, placed, brick after brick, until the numbers run into the millions. Its rulers left us almost no names. Their power survives in the sheer mass of what they built. No single household could build a defensive system on this scale. Someone had to coordinate people, resources, and time. Inside the city, archaeologists have identified areas interpreted as public and palatial complexes, along with spaces used for storage. Social and economic hierarchy becomes much more visible. But again, we should not invent more than the evidence allows. We can speak about organized authority with far greater confidence than in the Neolithic. What we cannot recover in detail are the titles of rulers, the exact structure of government, or the daily workings of administration. Archaeology reveals the system. The faces of that system are almost gone. And then the city itself disappears. Around 2350 BCE, early Bronze Age Jericho suffered a major fire and widespread destruction. In the archaeological record, one phase of urban life seems to end abruptly. What happened is less clear. External attack remains one proposed explanation, but no surviving text identifies attackers or even confirms a single specific scenario for the city's destruction. What we can see are the consequences: fire, damaged structures, a break in urban life. The catastrophe left a clearer trace than its cause. And this is where Jericho does something it will do again and again. Life returns. Not immediately in the same form. Not as an immortal city that cannot be destroyed. Rather, as a place that is simply too valuable to forget. The spring keeps flowing, indifferent to what has happened around it. The oasis remains an oasis. Roots still converge nearby. People come back. And with the water, they inherit a huge man-made mound left behind by those who lived here before them. At the beginning of the second millennium BCE, Jericho rises again. The Middle Bronze Age transforms it into a fortified Canaanite city-state. This time, the defensive architecture is truly monumental. The slopes of the tell are reinforced with massive earth and stone constructions. Later comes the so-called Cyclopean Wall, built from large limestone blocks. In some sections, the defensive system reached roughly 8 meters in height. From a distance, this city must have looked utterly different from the Neolithic settlement beside the spring. Not a scatter of low houses, a fortified city rising above the oasis. Walls, ramparts, controlled entrances, and water. Now not merely a condition for life, but a strategic resource. The defensive system probably helped control parts of the oasis and access to the key spring. Water, the reason settlement began here in the first place, had become part of the way the city defended itself. Behind the walls stood another world: palatial complexes, storage areas, workshops, dense residential quarters, a temple building measuring roughly 14 by 10 meters. Objects of Egyptian origin and Egyptian-style motifs reveal links with the Nile Valley. But that does not make Jericho an Egyptian city. It remained part of the Canaanite world, a landscape of smaller political centers caught between great powers, trade routes, and constantly shifting balances of influence. Sometimes archaeology even lets us approach the name a city may once have used. On one scarab, researchers read a group of signs that Lorenzo Negro has proposed connecting with the form Ruha, possibly an ancient name for Jericho. It is an intriguing hypothesis, but only a hypothesis. One object is not enough to settle the question, and that small find captures something essential about archaeology. Sometimes a single object opens a window into the past. Sometimes it only makes the mystery deeper. Then, around the middle of the 16th century BCE, the fortified city suffers another catastrophe. This time, the traces are especially vivid. Burned material, collapsed structures, damaged defenses. Radiocarbon studies of organic remains from the destruction layer place the event in the late 17th or 16th century BCE. In modern projectile chronologies, the end of the Middle Bronze Age city is usually placed around 1550 BCE. The city really did burn. The walls really were badly damaged. But the layer preserves no name for whoever may have caused it. The destruction has been linked to Egyptian military campaigns during the period associated with the expulsion of the Hyksos, and to other upheavals in the region. Such connections are possible, but direct proof is lacking. No inscription names the attacker. No document lets us reconstruct the course of events without interpretation. And this is where a problem emerges that, thousands of years later, will turn Jericho into the center of one of archaeology's most famous debates. The destroyed city is real. The collapse is real. The intense fire is real. But its state was not the one many researchers had expected. The Book of Joshua tells of Jericho's walls falling after the arrival of the Israelites. In popular culture, that story has become so fused with the name Jericho that almost any collapsed wall can look like ready-made archaeological confirmation. The history of the excavations shows how seductive such apparent matches can be. In the first half of the 20th century, John Garstang believed he had found a destroyed city that could be matched to a traditional biblical chronology. In the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon returned to the same mound with a more rigorous stratigraphic method and saw a different picture. Kenyon dated the major destruction of the powerful fortified city to the end of the Middle Bronze Age. In other words, significantly earlier than the period many scholars had tried to associate with the narrative in Joshua. Later radiocarbon studies broadly supported the earlier date for this major destruction. It might seem that the debate should have become simpler. Jericho refused to become a simple story. More recent excavations have shown that life at Tel es-Sultan did not vanish completely after the mid-2nd millennium catastrophe. A smaller settlement existed here in the late Bronze Age. Some older defensive elements continued in use or were repaired. Finds from the 14th century BCE, including an administrative cuneiform tablet and objects connected with the Egyptian cultural sphere, show that the site remained part of the region's political and economic world. That changes one crucial part of the picture. The old formula that Jericho no longer existed after 1550 BCE is too absolute, but that does not prove the opposite. The existence of a late Bronze Age settlement does not prove that archaeology has confirmed a literal reading of the Book of Joshua. Late Bronze Age material is comparatively limited. Some later deposits may have been disturbed by subsequent rebuilding. Evidence from the 13th century BCE remains sparse, and no specific destruction horizon has gained broad archaeological acceptance as a direct match for the biblical episode. Some researchers continue to propose alternative chronologies and different ways of reconciling the text with the excavations. That remains part of scholarly debate. A theory does not become fact simply because it is popular. The most responsible approach is to keep two pictures in view at once: an ancient text with its own history and significance, and an archaeological mound preserving a sequence of material layers. They can speak to some of the same historical questions, but they cannot simply be laid over one another like identical maps. And that brings us to another unexpected problem. What do we actually mean when we say the walls of Jericho? Which walls? The Neolithic stone wall of the 9th millennium BCE beside the mysterious tower? The massive mud brick fortifications of the early Bronze Age? Or the Canaanite defensive system of the 2nd millennium BCE? At the same place, walls were built, rebuilt, destroyed, reinforced, and buried beneath later structures for thousands of years. Cultural memory compressed them into a single image. Archaeology pulls that image apart and restores the chronology. The same thing happened to the tower. Once the tower rose above the early settlement, then it vanished beneath a later world. People in the Bronze Age may have lived above it without any idea that a structure already several thousand years old lay beneath their feet. Its builders disappeared from memory. Their language is unknown. Their names are unknown. We do not know who first proposed building it. We do not know how labor was organized.
We do not know whether people looked out from the tower toward the spring, the fields, approaching strangers, or the sky. The architecture outlived the explanation. That is one of archaeology's strangest truths. Stone can outlive thought. And it is not only Jericho that has changed. Our understanding of Jericho has changed as well. The major excavations of the 19th and early 20th centuries were often driven by attempts to connect archaeological remains with biblical narratives. Over time, the focus shifted. Archaeologists began to read stratigraphy, ceramic sequences, building phases, changes in layout, and the chronology of individual layers with increasing precision. Kathleen Kenyon's work in the 1950s was transformative precisely because the tell was treated as a complex archive rather than as one scene from a story whose ending was already known. Today, that archive is read with tools the earliest excavators could not have imagined. Radiocarbon analysis helps refine the dating of organic material. Isotopes can help indicate where a person likely spent the early years of life. Archaeobotany brings back into view the plants that grew, were gathered and were used thousands of years ago. Old collections are re-examined and old conclusions revised. Digital recording, photogrammetry, and three-dimensional modeling allow separate walls, rooms, and building phases to be assembled into a more coherent spatial picture. And here is the paradox. The more we learn about Jericho, the harder it becomes to describe it with one simple slogan: the first city in the world, the first fortress, the birthplace of agriculture. Those labels appeared again and again in popular writing, but discoverers across the Near East have shown that sedentary life, agriculture, and complex societies emerged in many centers and along different paths. Jericho does not need to be the one and only first to be extraordinary. Its real importance is more interesting than any record. In one place, an exceptionally long sequence of human experiments has survived. How to remain in one place, how to manage access to water, how to store food, how to organize labor on a monumental scale, how to maintain relationships with the dead, how to defend a settlement, how to build up reserves, how to build a city, and how to return after that city is destroyed. In 2023, ancient Tel es-Sultan was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, not as a backdrop to one famous event.
And not simply because of the title, Oldest City. Its value lies in the depth of its archaeological sequence. From early sedentary life and monumental pre-pottery Neolithic architecture to the developed urban societies of the Bronze Age. But dates and terminology still fail to capture the most important part. So for a moment, let us bring back a single morning. The sun is just beginning to rise over the Jordan Valley. The stone still holds the cool of the night. At the spring, water murmurs steadily. Beyond it begins a ribbon of green vegetation, sharply separated from the dry slopes around it. People are already moving between the mud brick houses. Someone carries gathered plants. Someone sits against a wall working flint. Someone mixes material to repair a floor. Dust, hearth smoke, and the smell of damp earth near the spring mingle in the air. Then a figure disappears into an opening at the base of the stone tower. Inside, it is darker. A foot touches the first narrow step, then the second, the third. The figure keeps climbing. They do not know the word Neolithic. They do not know that archaeologists will one day measure every step. They do not know that the tower will be described as one of the earliest known monumental structures of its scale. For them, all of this is simply the present. Now return to the same place, several thousand years later. The tower is gone from view. It lies underground. Another city stands above it. People move through Bronze Age streets. Storehouses hold supplies. Goods move through the gates. Beyond massive defenses, the oasis glimmers. Somewhere, an object made far away has arrived. Somewhere, someone keeps track of the stores. Perhaps a scribe, perhaps another official. Somewhere else, workers repair a wall without knowing that far older walls lie beneath them. For them, the builders of the Neolithic Tower already belonged to an almost unimaginable past. In fact, they were further removed from those builders than the Bronze Age is from us today. And then this city becomes a layer too. More centuries pass. Another fire, another wall, another house, another street. Jericho lets us watch not just a civilization, but the accumulation of the past itself. Every new inhabitant inherits a landscape already altered by those who came before. A new era does not begin on a blank page. It begins on ruins. Sometimes old bricks are dismantled. Sometimes an earlier wall becomes a foundation. Sometimes the old surface is buried, and building begins again above it. The tell grows slowly, layer by layer, generation by generation. And this is where digital reconstruction becomes as powerful as it is dangerous. Artificial intelligence can give motion back to the past. People walk the streets again. Dust lifts beneath their feet. Fabric moves in the wind. Smoke rises above hearths. Sunlight falls across limestone, while the ground near the spring darkens with moisture. Within seconds, the image begins to feel real. It feels as though a camera has genuinely entered the 9th millennium BCE. But no camera was there. Imagine stripping away from that reconstructed street everything we do not actually know, one layer at a time. First, the exact faces disappear. Then the patterns on the fabrics, the precise colors of individual doors. The words people used with one another disappear. The expression on the face of the person climbing the tower is gone. What remains is what can be supported by material evidence. The dimensions of certain structures, the position of the tower, the lines of some walls, and the building materials. We also have obsidian, pottery, storage facilities, seals, plant and animal remains, traces of fire, and sequences of destruction. Around that framework are empty spaces. Those are the spaces reconstruction has to fill with the most plausible details available. That is a legitimate part of reconstruction, as long as the viewer understands where evidence ends and reconstruction begins. The danger comes when the power of the image erases that boundary. A responsible reconstruction should not present the unknown as established fact. It can do something more interesting. It can make the past feel alive, while preserving room for what we still do not know. Because ancient Jericho cannot be shown honestly in one perfect image. It can only be shown as a process of transformation. First, a spring in a dry valley, and a few early dwellings beside it. The settlement grows denser. A stone wall appears. A tower rises above it. Time passes. Houses change. The economy changes. Domesticated sheep and goats appear among the buildings. The living maintain a special relationship with the dead, recreating the features of some faces. Obsidian arrives from far away, evidence of connections reaching beyond the horizon. But before this world can seem permanent, another begins to cover it. Millennia compress into seconds.
Early round mud brick structures give way to streets, storage buildings, and Bronze Age fortifications. New defensive lines rise over the oasis. Later come palatial complexes, a temple, and the massive walls of Canaanite Jericho. Then motion ends in fire. A wall collapses. A street empties. Dust settles over what, only moments before, was a city. Time passes, and people appear again. A new house rises among the ruins. Then another. One layer settles over another. The city contracts, returns, changes shape, and leaves behind yet another building phase. This is how Jericho moves through time, not upward on a neat staircase of progress, more like a pulse. Life gathers around water. It becomes denser. It breaks apart. And then it finds its way back to the same place. And perhaps Jericho's oldest monument is not the tower, not the wall, not even the spring. It is the human decision to return. Generations separated by thousands of years kept choosing the same place. Languages changed. Technologies changed. Religious ideas changed. Political systems vanished. Cities collapsed. And the water kept welling up from the earth. Gradually, a natural part of the valley became an archive of human presence. And that archive has still not been fully read. Some layers were destroyed by ancient rebuilding. Some have been excavated. Some remain underground. New methods have already changed ideas that seemed clear only a few decades ago. Isotope studies have refined our understanding of mobility among Neolithic inhabitants. Radiocarbon dating has revised the chronology of several destruction phases. New excavations have revealed late Bronze Age life, where the picture had once seemed far emptier. The next discovery may change it again, which means that no reconstruction we create today can ever be the final version of the past. Perhaps that is why Jericho matters more than any superlative, even the world's oldest city. It does not show a single moment when civilization suddenly appeared. It shows the process itself. It shows the moment human beings begin to build beyond the needs of the present. The stone tower outlives its builders. Bronze Age walls outlive rulers whose names disappear. Stories about the city outlive the walls themselves. And thousands of years later, we begin assembling Jericho again from fragments, layers, dates, pollen, bones, brick, charcoal, and a handful of surviving signs.
Today we add laboratories, digital models, and artificial intelligence to that process. We give movement back to the streets, form back to the houses, height back to the tower. But beneath every restored image remains another layer of uncertainty. And beneath the last excavated floor, there is still earth. If tomorrow archaeologists uncover another wall, another inscription, new dating evidence, or traces of a settlement we have not yet seen, which one would be the real Jericho? The one we reconstruct today? The one archaeologists pictured 50 years ago? Or the one still waiting for its first ray of light after thousands of years underground? Perhaps there never was a single, definitive Jericho. There were dozens of Jerichos. Again and again, one rose over the traces of another. For each generation, its own Jericho was simply the present, and another Jericho may still be hidden there, beneath us.